And I'm going to start with a brief explanation of who the IIRC is. We are a global coalition. We are celebrating our 10th anniversary this year. We came into being after the 2008 financial crisis. And we're a broad umbrella of investors and regulators, companies, NGOs, accounting standard setters, and the accounting profession more broadly. And the C of the IIRC Council is made up of about 50 or 60 different organizations. As you can see from this slide, it's a wide range of corporations, accounting firms, standard setters, and all those who influence and have a degree of leadership around corporate reporting reform. Our vision at the IRRC is very clear. It's to align capital allocation and corporate behavior to the wider goals of financial stability and sustainable development through the cycle of integrated reporting and thinking. And I'd really like to draw your attention to those two goals of financial stability and sustainable development. The financial stability was particularly pertinent in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. And as we record this, we are all in Europe and around the world in the midst of a second major economic crisis. So never has the goal of integrated reporting and thinking, I think, been more pertinent than it is today. And sustainable development, of course, has come into its own, particularly with the Sustainable Development Goals in the last few years. And I will talk more about what we mean by the cycle of integrated reporting. So as I said, we are celebrating our 10th anniversary this year. We have been through a number of different phases of our strategy, from the feasibility phase in the early days through to the creation phase and the breakthrough phase, which finished about 3 years ago. And we're now in the momentum phase of the IIRC's strategy, which we hope presages global adoption of integrated reporting. Now, the early phases of the integrated reporting movement were very much about testing the draft framework, which was released in its final form in 2013, and having a cohort of businesses and investors who are happy to test the effectiveness and the impact of the integrated reporting framework. And the momentum phase, which we are towards the tail end of this stage, has been about building momentum in key markets around the world. And integrated reporting has developed considerably over the years since those initial phases. Today, we believe there are approximately 2,000 companies globally which have adopted the integrated reporting framework or are copying it, following it very closely. We believe that the integrated reporting framework has been reflected in corporate reporting practices in more than 70 countries and has been integrated into the regulatory policies of more than 20 national and supranational regulators. And that represents very solid progress over the years. We're confident that integrated reporting meets the needs of investors and other stakeholders in enabling an organization to communicate how effectively it is creating value over time, and for providing decision useful information for the consumers of that information. Now, our next phase is the global adoption phase, and this in many ways is the most ambitious phase of integrated reporting. And our ambition here is that integrated reporting should be adopted as the de facto type of reporting around the world. And in order to achieve that, it's likely that governments will need to regulate, to mandate or encourage integrated reporting, that accounting standard setters will endorse it, that stock markets will integrate integrated reporting as an element of their stock market listing requirements, and of course that businesses will see the benefit from integrated reporting, and on a voluntary basis will adopt integrated reporting, and will evangelize for the benefits that they see to their business in terms of managing the business in a sustainable way by drawing on the principles of integrated thinking, and also that they will see the benefits to the consumers, the readers of their corporate reports. Well, why does this matter? There are two primary drivers behind why integrated reporting matters or why it mattered in the first 2 decades, why it has mattered in the first 2 decades of the 21st century. And the first is to do with hidden value. Now, you may be familiar with this study by Ocean Tomu. They redo the study about every 5 years. And what this shows is where value resides within an organization relative to market value for the S&P 500. And it tells a very interesting story, because if we go back a generation to the mid-1970s, what we see is that about 80% of a company's market value can be accounted through its tangible assets, and only about 20% of its market value was accounted for by intangible assets. Now, as an auditor in the mid-1970s, this would have placed the audit firms in a very strong position, because as they conducted their annual audit, they could be fairly confident that through the audit, they were accounting for approximately 80% of the market value of a company, with the 20% as that balancing item of intangible assets. Now, if we move forward to the mid-2010s to 2015, there's almost a perfect inversion of that story. And what we see now, again, this is not the case for every company in every industry, but as an average across the S&P 500, that now approximately 87% of an organization's market value is accounted for by the intangibles, and only 13% is accounted for by the tangibles. Now, as an auditor in the mid-2010s, that position would be much less comfortable, because as I conduct my audit and sign off the accounts for the company, for a typical S&P 500 company, my audit team would only be accounting for about 13%, which is clearly a very unsatisfactory situation to be in. Now, where do the intangible assets lie? This is broader than an accountant's definition of intangible assets. This is the things which all of us who work for organizations have an intuitive understanding about, but we're often very poor at communicating that internally and externally to the markets. So this might be the value of our colleagues, the knowledge that they have of how the organization functions and what its purpose is more broadly. It might be the social and relationship capital of customers or of suppliers who may be critical to the organization's business model. It may be the intellectual capital, which hasn't yet been codified into patents and trademarks and the kinds of things which accountants are very comfortable with accounting for. Maybe the natural capital that the organization draws on but doesn't own. And if it doesn't own it, and it's therefore from an economics perspective an externality, the organization is probably not accounting for it, and yet maybe drawing on that through its business model, or having an impact on that through its operations. So the critical point here is that organizations are, through their formal financial accounts, accounting for an ever smaller proportion of their actual market value. Now, in parallel with that, there's been the growth and the maturing of sustainability. And if we look back to the origins of sustainability in the 80s, it was really corporate philanthropy and the idea that an organization might give away a proportion of its profits through good works and charitable causes. In the 1990s, that morphed into health, safety, and the environment, and the importance for an organization to keep its people safe and to minimize the impacts that it might have in terms of environmental spillages, for example. From the beginning of this millennium, sustainability has become much more integral to the corporate business model. And we saw at the very end of the last millennium, in 1999, GRI come on to the stage, and really GRI and others who have followed in their wake, SASB, TCFD, etc. They have created non-financial reporting standards for how an organisation should record its broader impacts on the world around it. Now, the problem with that was that for a long period, these reports the information tended to be reported separately through a standalone sustainability report. And sustainability became rather divorced from the core elements of the business model, the products, the services that a business creates, and the manner in which it goes about organizing its operations. And integrated reporting attempts to bring those two perspectives together. So there's a holistic approach to how an organization is creating value in both the short term and the longer term. And most importantly, the connections are made between those non-financial impacts, as they're referred to, and the financial impacts. Now, at the IRRC, we prefer to think about pre-financial impacts on the basis that any material impact that an organization has, even if it's an externality at this point in time, is likely in a future point to start impacting on the cash flow of an organization or its financial accounting performance. And then if one looks forward to the 2020s, what might we see? Well, I very much hope in this period of the Sustainable Development Goals, where businesses are being asked to harness their corporate muscle towards the delivery of national and international goals, which fundamentally would improve the livelihoods and the health prospects of the great mass of humanity, that we might see businesses moving into a regenerative model. So we see this, for example, with the concept of the circular economy, and the idea that a business will contribute more than it distracts, than it takes away from the world around it. And many companies have started to explore concepts such as net positive, the idea that if you look at all of an organization's impacts, from its accounting performance through to its natural capital impacts, its human capital impacts, etc., that overall it's creating value for society. Now, I hope you're all familiar with the integrated reporting framework. This year, we are undergoing a review of the framework for the first time since it was published. And this is an opportunity to really assess whether there's any change that's needed to the framework. And the integrated reporting framework, as I hope you're familiar with, is made up of fundamental concepts, guiding principles, and content elements. Now, the key thing here is that it is a principles-based framework and therefore eminently adaptable to changes which have been occurring and will continue to occur, particularly to non-financial standards. And the essence of the integrated reporting framework is this model here. And here we can see the business model in the center, the capitals as inputs on the left-hand side, and then capitals as outputs and outcomes on the right. And this is where the integrated reporting framework addresses that gap that we saw in the Ocean Tomo study of where does value reside. Because in the integrated reporting framework, there are 6 capitals: financial capital, that accountants have been very familiar with and have worked with for many centuries: manufactured capital, intellectual capital, human capital, social and relationship capital, and natural capital. Now, why does this matter? Well, it's helpful to understand why do businesses report the information they do, and how does that information get used by the capital markets. Now, the integrated reporting framework has been very clear that our primary audience, or the primary audience of an integrated report, is providers of financial capital, so equity providers and debt holders. At the same time, an integrated report is also there for other stakeholders, and that's not to say that the broader stakeholder groups are less important than the financial capital providers, but they are the primary audience of an integrated report. Now, EY, the accounting firm, does a very comprehensive study of how non-financial information why it is produced in the first place, and how it is used by investors. And I just wanted to draw your attention to a handful of these, the insights from this study, because I think it sheds a lot of light on the true value of an integrated report. So why do companies publish ESG data, is the phrase that's used. So ESG is, the E is environmental, the S is social, and the G is governance. Well, let's start with why they don't. And it's encouraging to see that the reason that they don't do this is it's generally not done for public relations or marketing purposes. The reason that it's done is first and foremost to comply with regulatory requirements. For a European audience at this seminar, you'll all be very familiar, I'm sure, with the EU Non-Financial Reporting Directive, which is also going through a review process at the moment. And that has had a very significant impact on the types of information that companies report, which goes beyond the statutory financial statements. And then the three other primary reasons are demonstrating how an organization is managing its risks, explaining their strategy to generate shareholder value over the long term. So a very clear echo there of the purpose of an integrated report, and to respond to competitive pressure. Businesses, of course, operate on the whole, intensely competitive environment, and we'll often see one of their peers publishing ESG information or non-financial information, and will follow suit. So how does this information impact on decision making, particularly investor decision making? Well, the story here again is an encouraging one, and the trend over time with the EY report has been that the upper end of each of these questions tends to get stronger from year to year. So about a third of them will apply a structured, methodical evaluation of this data to support their portfolio decision making. And 2/3, roughly, will also evaluate non-financial disclosures informally. So the key point here is that the information is being used to support decision making. And what are they particularly influenced by? Well, the chart on the left-hand side, which is the most recent chart that's available for this particular study, is to assess governance practices, to look at risks in the supply chain of an organization, to look at the risks associated with human rights, and risks from climate change. Now, when EY releases the next iteration of this study, which will be, as I understand it, later this year, I think we can expect that climate change one to rise up the agenda under the impact of TCFD. But the key thing here is that investors are using ESG information, and they're using it to assess the underlying sustainability of the businesses they invest in, and whether there are systemic risks to those businesses from how they manage themselves, from how they manage their suppliers, from the labor practices, and from the impact of global issues such as climate change. And when we asked investors which types of reports did they find most useful, number one, which again is very encouraging to see, is the integrated report. And what we can see here is that nearly 90% of respondents, and this survey is based on an investor poll, a global investor poll of about 1,500 investors. So it's a very broad and representative sample. 90% have said that they find integrated reports very useful, and 6% have said essential. Now, one should perhaps ask what they meant by an integrated report. Many of them will have seen this in the pure approach of an IRRC type integrated report. But even if they have a slightly more relaxed view, what they will be referring to here is a report in which business performance and financial accounting performance has been balanced with broader explanations of how the business is preserving value or creating value and protecting value in the short and the long term. And ESG is an essential element of that. So that is encouraging to see how integrated reports are being used by investors. The investors were asked whether it would be helpful for there to be prescriptive non-financial accounting standards. And here what we see is that about 2/3 of investors would find prescriptive accounting standards for non-financial information very beneficial, with about 1/3 saying somewhat beneficial. And again, particularly at the juncture we are now, where with the EU having signalled in January that they intend to identify the non-financial accounting standards that companies should or must be using when it comes to their broader ESG performance. I think within the EU, we're likely to see, and I'm sure Liliana will speak further about this in the next session, we're likely to see a move towards mandatory non-financial accounting standards. And an integrated report is seen by investors as being very beneficial, somewhat beneficial in terms of progressing the uptake and endorsement of non-financial accounting by companies. But the most important thing here is that it's the mandatory application of non-financial accounting standards which will really move the dial. And as I said earlier, the great benefit of an integrated report and the IRRC's International Integrated Reporting Framework is because it is a principles-based framework, it will always be able to accommodate changes to non-financial standards and new standards which come into being. And that's something which I have no doubt will be preserved as we move through the refresh of the integrated reporting framework. And then just to wrap up very briefly, integrated thinking, of course, is the other element of the integrated reporting cycle. And integrated thinking is how a business manages itself internally, how its strategy and business model and sustainable management of the precious resources and capitals that it depends on for its value creation model are managed in a sustainable way, with a focus both on value creation in the short term, but also value creation in the long term. And one phrase which one often hears is of companies looking to optimize financial value creation and optimize value creation across the other types of capital, rather than a fixation on maximizing financial value creation at all costs. And companies which have practiced integrated thinking have, through surveys and through case studies, have indicated very strongly that this has helped create incremental value and enhance their value creation characteristics of their business model. And finally, I'm sure the slides will be circulated, various resources that may help you as you progress on your integrated reporting journey and embed integrated thinking into your organizations.